I'm still seeing a couple of folks logging in, but I think we're going to go ahead and get started so that we have plenty of time for discussion this afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to the second talk in our lecture series on housing issues facing our clients and other impoverished residents of North Carolina. My name is Peter Gilbert. I'm the program director on the legal aid side for the Durham Eviction Diversion Program, which is a partnership with the Duke Civil Justice Clinic. There's been a lot of attention on evictions this year, and rightly so, given the double-edged sword of the pandemic, which has first kept millions of renters from being able to pay their rent, and then it's condemned these families to potential COVID exposure if they are evicted. But we recognize that evictions are just one aspect of the deep housing-related problems in this country. This lecture series seeks to explore both the roots of our housing crisis, starting with our first lecture by Richard Rothstein on how government policies created and continue to foster racially segregated housing. And now we're going to start looking at the impacts tied to housing conditions as we continue this week exploring some of the public health and environmental justice consequences that are directly tied to where you live. Before introducing our speaker, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke, Duke Law School, and the Gothic. I'd also like to thank all the donors who have already given to Legal Aid's housing work and our rental assistance fund in Durham. Raising money for these funds is a big part of why we're hosting this lecture series. I'd especially like to thank the Rotary Club of Durham, who just made a large contribution to our Durham Rental Assistance Fund. In their words, by assisting tenants with the resources to help pay rent owed, we help relieve the stress, worry, tension, and pressure on tenants and their families. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank Dr. Alexis Clark and our development and public relations staff and their team of volunteers and interns who have made this lecture series possible. Catherine Coleman Flowers has worked to explain how inadequate disposal systems for human waste not only subject many Americans to disgusting living conditions that have resulted in the reappearance of once vanquished diseases and parasites, but also work to keep them poor and criminalize poverty by subjecting them to fines, arrests, and even imprisonment. I am personally very appreciative of the work she has done to bring this struggle to national attention. My first 5 years before practicing law at Legal Aid, I worked representing communities in North Carolina in exactly the same fight for access to water and sewer systems. In one community we jointly represented with Legal Aid of North Carolina's Fair Housing Project, the mostly white county sought to expand its only landfill in one of its few African-American neighborhoods, which relied on shallow wells and older septic systems. The county had already placed its sewer treatment plant in this neighborhood and issued permits for spray fields. And then in the final insult, they moved the animal shelter to this neighborhood and connected water and sewer to the animal shelter while continuing to deprive the Black residents of access to its water and sewer system, even though they hosted the sewer treatment plant. Our work representing tenants at Legal Aid is part of the same effort. We regularly represent tenants whose landlords fail to provide or adequately maintain their wells and septic systems. One study of the impacts of housing segregation in North Carolina found that supermajority non-white neighborhoods, which are disproportionately rental housing, were twice as likely to be near a solid waste facility or other EPA-registered point source polluters. These environmental justice problems are only compounded by higher rates of dilapidated housing and a lack of infrastructure. While our first goal in the eviction diversion program is to keep tenants in their homes, safe from COVID and the severe disruption of evictions, we simultaneously represent families in fighting housing discrimination and the lack of safe, affordable, and habitable homes. If you can, please donate to help us in our legal advocacy or to our new Durham Rental Assistance Fund to help those who've fallen behind in their rent. We also welcome volunteers, especially attorneys, and you can learn more about how to volunteer with us through our website, legalaidnc.org. It is my pleasure now to introduce our main speaker this afternoon, Catherine Coleman Flowers. She is the founder and current director of the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice, and since 2008 has been the Rural Development Manager at the Race and Poverty Initiative of the Equal Justice Initiative. Catherine also serves as a member of the Board of Directors for the Climate Reality Project and is a senior fellow for the Center for Earth Ethics at Union Theological Seminary. An internationally recognized advocate for the human right to water and sanitation, Catherine was recently named as a 2020 MacArthur Fellow. She lives in her home in Montgomery, Alabama. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. That was very kind, Peter. I am just thrilled to be here today because I wish I could be there in person because one of my favorite states is North Carolina, and I've spent a lot of time working in North Carolina with Duke University and other partners that we have there, people in Mebane, North Carolina. Also, I give a shout out to the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network, which has led the way in terms of environmental justice uh, for such a long time, and need to get that recognition. But I come today as really a country girl from Lowndes County, Alabama. My experiences there have prepared me for what we're encountering now. And I often like to start talking about my own um, personal upbringing in a rural community. My father always believed that we should have a home, and he was from Lowndes County. And as a young man, a young father, his aspiration was to buy land and to build a house. And I just remember him when we were kids taking us out in the countryside and pointing out places and talking about how that was such a nice house seat. I know people probably don't use that term anymore, but it kind of dates me. But he talked about where the house could be situated on property that he just dreamed about potentially owning. And eventually he was able to buy property in Lowndes County and build a house. But even then, when we built the house, the home was our first home was a cinder block house that had the roughings for the plumbing, for a kitchen and a bathroom. However, we had a well that was outside of the house, and we had an outhouse, and so we did not have access to indoor plumbing. So my experience with waste started very young when we moved back to Lowndes County, which is where my father was. But to show the relationship to housing, a lot of the homes that were in Lowndes County at that time did not have indoor plumbing. They didn't have a kitchen. People had to warm their water, and when they warmed their water, they used that to either to wash dishes or do whatever they needed to do to sanitize things in the kitchen. Likewise, when it came to using the bathroom, they had to use um, whatever means were available and take it outside the house because at night you weren't going to walk outside to use an outhouse. And then, of course, when it came to taking a bath, there was you had to heat the water and then put that water in a tub and take a bath in that water. It was not the way it is now in terms of conveniences, but a lot of Black communities were that way because they were restricted because of racial covenants in terms of where to settle or who would either even sell land to them. And what I realized so many years later is that these historical inequities have been baked into our system so much so that even people that are well intentioned sometimes end up being exploiters of this and benefiting, and the people that have suffered so long continue to suffer. Fast forwarding, leaving Lowndes County and going to other places where I saw that everyone had access. The first time I left and went outside the area, I was 16. I went to Washington, D.C., and I lived in a community called Chevy Chase with a family. I talk about it in my book with the Hackett family. The Hackett family was a very interesting group of people that had a lot of influence over my life at that time. They were, Dave Hackett had been the best friend of Bobby Kennedy. They went to boarding school together and then continued to work together until Bobby Kennedy's untimely death. And then, of course, his wife had been a member of the Royal Ballet, and they met in Canada and then got married and had a family. And Dave was very, very active through the Youth Policy Institute and bringing young people first with the Robert Kennedy Memorial Foundation, and then the Youth Policy Institute, bringing young people to Washington to learn about government and policy and how they can influence that. And that was very eye-opening for me. And when I went to Washington, I saw, how people lived there was so different from what I saw in Lowndes County. And then going back to Lowndes County, I realized that things were not normal in terms of what was happening in other parts of the world. When people went to, and in Lowndes County, a lot of people were land rich, but could not get access to the kinds of loans and mortgages to buy houses. So they started to buy mobile homes. And mobile homes at that time provided an alternative to families, and in some cases that were living in shacks. Housing for a lot of families, if we go back and look at history of places like Lowndes County, a lot of the housing was provided by uh, the people that owned the plantations, and they had replaced slavery with sharecropping. So part of sharecropping and the labor was to provide housing, but to live in that house you had to work. And one of the vivid memories that I have is people living in shacks in Lowndes County, and the cotton growing up to the front doors and the back doors, like there was an ever-present uh, uh, opportunity for them to look out the door and see that you were here to pick this cotton and to produce the labor that was needed for them to, for the person who owned the plantation to get profit. And even those people were denied access to plumbing and denied access to water, uh, that they generally had to go and get it out of a well. And at that time, they weren't even testing the water. So it's been a problem that has been baked so much into our system that sometimes we pretend like, or we think that is normal because we've seen it for so long. And since I've started doing this work and going to other areas, I realized that it's not a Southern problem. It's not an Alabama problem. It's not just a North Carolina problem. It's a problem throughout the United States. Even in indigenous communities, we found this to be an issue where there's a lack of housing and there's also a lack of sanitation. And sanitation, and as I define it, is being able to have access to not only a toilet, but the treatment. Once you flush the toilet, what happens once it goes outside on the ground? And I think that that is part of a housing issue, but it's part of a larger problem around historical inequities that have been, as I said before, baked into our system, that we need to dig them out and dismantle them once and for all. As I got more involved in this issue, I moved back to Lowndes County, and one of the first things I noticed when I was staying in my mother's house was the sewage was running back into the house. And at that time, we thought it was a plumbing problem. It would come in by way of the tub. But it was even later when I found out, trying to do economic development, that the county health department was criminalizing people, and this because of a state law that was written, were criminalizing people for not having uh, access to sanitation. And when we got involved initially, what we were told, it was because people could not afford it. That's only part of the problem. What we found out was that it was not that they just could not afford it, the technologies. We also found people that had technologies that simply were not working. Uh, the initial narrative that we were given, we accepted it and we worked based on that. And we actually hired people who we found out later, we didn't know it then. That's why you have to do your research and vet people and know who you're dealing with, who actually wrote the law to criminalize people in Alabama. But they were recommended by the state health department. And those people designed systems that have since failed. And then from there, we decided that we were going to do our own study, and we were funded by EPA to do a house-to-house survey. We went from house to house in Lowndes County, and that's how we got the detail that got down to the nitty-gritty. And we found out that the wastewater problem wasn't simply that people could not afford these on-site septic systems. It was also because they were failing. We found out that people in the community were waiting for somebody to come and ask them what was going on. Because oftentimes what happens is that, and this is one of the fallacies of the academic communities, people have an idea that they want to write and somebody approves and say, this is a good, good theory to do this study based on, and it may not be based in the reality of what's actually happening on the ground. And they try to make the study fit what they're trying to determine, as opposed to going asking the people what's really going on. And in this case, we just asked simple questions, and the questions that were composed were developed by people from the community. And part of finding out these answers, you got to have the trust and be able to always be engaged with people that are impacted, as opposed to going in trying to, to save them without really understanding what the problems are. So in our case, we developed this house-to-house survey with local people who were not elected officials, but they were people that lived in the community, that experienced the problem themselves, and folk trusted them. And we went from house to house, and we not only went to people out in unincorporated areas, we went to the incorporated areas too. And actually, based on that, we found out that there was raw sewage everywhere. We found out there were three problems that people had. One is that some people were straight piping. Means that when they flushed their toilet, it went straight out on the ground. Number two, we found that people had paid for and invested in wastewater treatment systems that had failed, and they were held responsible for that. And then three, we found out that there were people that were part of treatment systems were paying wastewater fees, and they were failing too. And then the narrative became, well, people need to be educated. They can't maintain the systems. But what we're finding now, not just from Lowndes County, but from reports throughout the US, that these systems are failing. And one of the reasons that they're failing is because of climate change. Another reason that they're failing is because of racial covenants on housing in terms of where people could settle. In a lot of cases, people in African American communities had to settle in places that were not the most favorable places to settle. They usually were low-lying areas, more subject to flooding, which is not good for on-site sanitation. And oftentimes, these areas were, because of these restricted covenants, they also were denied access to water and sanitation. And we can find today in communities around the country, including in North Carolina, that there are communities that have been left out and left behind. In my own community, I live in Montgomery, Alabama, and recently found out that there are lots of people in Montgomery, Alabama that are not on wastewater treatment. These are people that are using on-site septics in the city of Montgomery, which is unfounded. And the narrative coming from the Water and Sewer Board is that we don't build sewers. So, but apparently they did build sewers when they put them in the white communities, but now that the Black communities are asking for equity, they still want to put them on septic systems. And these are communities where Black folk could only buy land at that time that was not considered suitable, and it certainly is not suitable for septic. Recently, I went to a home, a very nice home, of a family that had been in that home for 17 years, and their septic system had started to back up into their house. She told me that she was the woman that lived there, said that she was unable to take a shower in her home because the sewage was backing up into her shower. So she called someone to come and check out her septic system, and they broke the lid on it when they went there. So now the septic system is exposed. You can actually look into it and see all the sewage that's coming from the house. But she was told that to repair it, it was going to cost from $5,000 to $25,000. So we felt that that was a wide range and a wide disparity. So we sent our own engineers out to look at it, and they told us that the system would cost $18,500 to replace it, because it needs to be replaced. And that because her land, the amount of land that she has there, the system that they need is an aerobic system, and also because of the high water table. Well, the unfortunate thing about this is that she cannot afford that. And also the sewer main is about 500 feet from her home. And it makes more sense to connect to the sewer. But what does that mean in terms of housing? It means that the value of the properties there are not what they could be in a comparable neighborhood that was white, because they don't have access to sanitation. Also, the fact that they are denying these communities access is impacting what can go into those communities in terms of services. That you're not going to be able to find uh, a pharmacy locating there because it does not have, they're not going to be there and be on a septic system. And that means that they're going to have to travel outside of their communities to be able to have access to those types of services. However, when I would serve as the economic development coordinator, I found that these services were readily made available to businesses that were located in the area that did not have to pay for water and sanitation, that the government monies were used to do that. But that is not afforded to residents. And I think if we gave the same type of access to individuals, to homeowners, to people living in the communities that we give to businesses, then we would not have some of the problems that we have now. But that type of discrimination, I think, is created the type of problems that we've had and that we've seen exacerbated with COVID. Recently, the housing issue has become even more glaring. One, because a lot of people are unable to work. And those that have been able to work, especially in the communities where I work, a lot of them have had to go home to small homes and could not socially isolate and bring COVID home to their family members. In some cases in Lowndes County, I know one family that I grew up next door to in Lowndes County lost 3 family members to COVID, the father, the son, and a daughter. It has been devastating. It has exposed to the world the inequities that exist, and especially here in the United States. And it started with, I think, in the beginning with ignoring the fact that these disparities and inequities were going to make people of color far more vulnerable. And it started with an administration that didn't care. And a lot of, and COVID got out of hand in a lot of these communities that are still suffering from it. It has compounded the housing problem. And I think that we're going to probably see more evictions. And we'll probably also see, especially once they take the moratorium off evictions, and we'll probably see a lot of people actually losing their homes because if they're unable to work or they have lost a breadwinner because of COVID and they didn't have insurance, we're going to see them getting deeper into poverty instead of coming out of poverty. And we have to come up with ways to address that. In terms of wastewater and housing, one of the things that we're asking people to do, we have a project with the Guardian newspaper, which is out of the UK, but they have a US location as well. And what we're doing is looking at wastewater disparities throughout the United States. And we're asking people to go to our website, which we will hopefully later share with you, and report if you're experiencing either straight piping, failing on-site septic, or you're paying for wastewater treatment and it's not working properly. Out of that, we've gotten people around the country that have reported it. And it's so connected to the housing issue. I think that until we started doing this report, I didn't really understand how connected it is. One place that I had the opportunity to visit, but it was also the first story that was done in The Guardian on this problem, was in Centerville, Illinois. In Centerville, Illinois, which is it's actually outside of St. Louis, and a lot of people moved to that area. They said when they originally moved there, it was a mostly white area, and they started opening it up and selling to Black families. And then the white families moved out. But if you go there now, you can see where the streets are falling away because of the water tables have to be very high. The sewage systems have broken down and sewage is coming back into the homes of the families there. Their housing value have gone down. These are people that a lot of them were government employees. They were middle class when they moved there. And now in their older age, their homes are worthless. When they have gone to, because of the destruction, because of the sewage and the flooding that goes on there, when they've gone to try to get loans to repair their homes, they couldn't, and they found out that the value of their homes have dropped dramatically. So at a time when you would think that they would be able to retire and be comfortable in their homes, they can't fix the problem. They can't get help for the problem. And of course, the home prices have dropped. So a lot of people that from the outside come in and say, why don't they move? Why should they have to move? And that is one of the things that we hear a lot. And the people that say this are the ones that are not dealing with the problem. They obviously are the ones who can afford to be somewhere else and they have options. But these are families that have invested and their investment was not protected because they were generally people of color. And as a result of all the things that are happening around environmental and climate justice, they're suffering. Another town that we found out about in an area that's one of the uh, wealthiest counties in New York and probably one of the wealthiest in the United States, in Westchester County, there's a place called Mount Vernon. They reached out to us when the first article came out about Centerville to tell us about the problems that they were having as well. And in Mount Vernon, the sewage started to slowly fail. The sewage treatment started to slowly fail, and it started to impact the homes. So they, the city tried to repair as much as they could, but when the infrastructure is old or is not built to last, or is not built to even deal with climate change, it's a problem. And because um, it is no longer working, sewage started to come back into people's homes. And one of the families that was interviewed, the woman said that her children had to move away to another area where they did not have to deal with that problem. And her grandchildren refers to her house as the poop house. Again, the value of the properties will never be what they should be, even in the wealthiest county, one of the wealthiest counties in the United States, because of the lack of wastewater treatment that is sustainable. So we're finding that these issues are throughout the U.S. And if we've talked to our brothers and sisters that are in indigenous communities in Alaska who are having wastewater issues as well, that's exacerbated by climate change. And in their communities, one of the persons who I've gotten to grown to admire quite a bit is she lives in Anchorage, and she serves with me on the WEJAC, the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. And in Alaska, they're losing villages to climate change because of the melting permafrost. But it's also exposing, she said, the pipes that are carrying the sewage. And the sewage really has nowhere to go because it's melting now. So things that have been uncovered, I have been covered for a very long time, are being uncovered, and we have to do it differently. So across the U.S., we're finding this to be a problem. And if we go to Allensworth in California, Allensworth was a town that was founded by a colonel who had served as a chaplain, and a group of Black men got together and decided that they wanted to build an area where Black people can live and not have to worry about Jim Crow. And they built this area in the Central Valley in California. And a lot of people moved there. And Colonel Allensworth was actually killed when some men ran over him. He was a circuit pastor and had gone to the town where he was serving as a minister and was walking when they ran over him and killed him. But they were, prior to that time, Allensworth was being positioned to become the Tuskegee of the West. But after the death of Colonel Allen, they changed, the legislature no longer was support building the vocational school that was going to be located there. But in addition to that, Allensworth has suffered because of the water has been depleted so much, so the groundwater, that the arsenic that's in the water is greater than the water itself, and people can't drink it. But also people are straight piping there. And when I went to Allensworth in the Central Valley, what really struck me was seeing people living in mobile homes. And a lot of the people there now are migrant workers, and they're living in mobile homes. And I was told by one of the persons who was taking us around, that who was also a volunteer firefighter, that generally when they go to an area and they see the greenest patch on the land, they know that the person does not have a way to treat wastewater. And this is a place that's really devoid of a lot of water. Um, and it is shows that there is a connection. We cannot afford to have people in the world, not just in the US, to not have access to water and sanitation. And that is a part of housing. And that's why everyone should have a house or at least a place to live. And I think that another one of the sustainable development goals should be the human right to housing. And it shouldn't just be any kind of housing, but we should have housing that protect them from the environment. And in places like Alabama, we've had the climate change has really exposed again the housing issues, because we've had these storms that have been so bad lately, excuse me, that generally it is not, and we may hear this in North Carolina whenever there's tornadoes or straight line winds, when there is a warning that they're telling people to get out of these homes because they're not safe, especially if they're in mobile homes. And a lot of poor families are ending up in mobile homes. So these issues are in fact connected. And lastly, if you look at climate gentrification, I know in North Carolina, there's a lot of environmental justice issues. Uh, and we're going to see where people are going to have to move away from the coast and where they're going. In Florida, they're seeing that in real time, especially in the Miami area. And in Miami Beach, where everybody wanted to be, they're losing the area to sea level rise. And as a result, the area that was once the only place where people of color could live, those areas are the higher ground now because they were not along the beach, and they're being pushed out because of climate gentrification. And gentrification has done a lot to displace people. And we have to talk about, as we talk about housing, how do we deal with gentrification and making sure that we don't push out people that have been there forever when those areas, of course, become desirable to other folks. So all of these issues are connected. And for me, I'm better off actually engaging in questions around this. And if you have not read my book, Waste, I would ask you to read it, and you will be able to draw the parallels and see what is happening around housing, around wastewater and sanitation, and how it's all connected. But I'm going to stop here and take questions. Um, and I love to have a dialogue. I see there are a lot of people uh, that are part of this webinar, so let's get started.
Catherine, thank you so much. It's hard to give an appropriate round of applause on Zoom, but that was amazing and inspiring, and we have gotten several questions. So thanks so much for your talk and your experience and your continued advocacy, and for your willingness to engage in some questions. So one of the first ones we got in was asking about the use of septic tanks and the prevalence of these problems in urban areas as well as in rural areas. And you talked about Westchester County, and you talked about the community outside of St. Louis. You know, the person asking the question wants to ask about specifically sort of unincorporated areas around Metro Atlanta. You know, in Durham, at the end of 2019, our local housing authority was actually assessed a large fine for having a raw sewage leak behind our largest public housing development, McDougal Terrace. And unfortunately, that issue was kind of overshadowed a couple of months later by a massive series of carbon monoxide leaks that displaced most of the community. But, you know, this exposure to raw sewage was, affected a very urban public housing community here in Durham. And so I guess the question is, you know, how do we draw these connections that this is not just a rural issue, right? And at the same time, you talked about the human right to housing. Do you think that affordable housing and subsidized housing and adequate funding for the maintenance of subsidized and affordable and public housing is an environmental justice issue? And how do we tie those struggles together around access to affordable housing and environmental justice?
Well, first of all, let me take the first question first. Yes, these issues are connected because we tend to see the same communities impacted by it, whether they're in rural communities or whether they're in urban communities. They're generally marginalized peoples. They're generally either people of color, they're indigenous, or they're poor. Though that we see that whether they're in the city or whether they're in an unincorporated area. So the areas that I mentioned, um, the two actually most of the areas that I mentioned, the people are not on septic tanks now. In Centerville, Illinois, they're not on septic tanks; they're on the wastewater treatment system, and they're paying a wastewater treatment fee for something that's not working, and their houses are full of sewage. Um, and a lot of people talk about it coming into their basement. And I actually saw more sewage on the ground there than I saw in Lowndes County. In Westchester County, this was in the town of Mount Vernon. So obviously not a rural area. It's all connected. And I think it's all connected. And what connects is and what makes these environmental justice issues are um, uh, the communities that are impacted over and over and over again, the communities that are overburdened over and over again. So those people that can fight and can afford to fight generally don't have these problems. I can give you an example. This is a water issue, but not around sanitation. But in West Memphis right now, there's a fight going on with the Bahia pipeline, where they want to run this pipeline through an aquifer. And West Memphis is a predominantly Black area that also includes some freedmen's towns that are there. And when the company decided where they were going to run this pipeline, they basically stated publicly that they were going to go through the area of the least resistance, and that's what they thought. But the community was resisting. Now, as it relates to housing and these issues, yes, I think that, and the question had many components to it, but yes, I think it is an environmental justice issue, because oftentimes a lot of these public houses, I've been hearing lately about public houses being built on Superfund sites. And generally the communities that are suffering the most are basically marginalized communities. As I said before, people of color, people that end up in public housing generally are people that are not, wealthy. And folk feel like they can cite everything next to those communities, and they should. And the communities should have a voice in what goes next to them, because they're impacted by that severely. And all of these issues, in my view, are in fact connected. I don't think that they're separate. I even think that, I'm going to take it even further. I think anywhere people are housed, we need to look at it and look at it through a lens of equity, including prisons. I mean, people feel that, well, they got meals and a place to stay, but a lot of these prisons are suffering from the same problems because they're citing them in areas that that are not desirable in terms of being able to house a lot of folk, and they are exposed to all these toxins. In some cases, they're talking about building prisons on Superfund sites. So we have to draw the correlation and see that these communities are overburdened already with these environmental justice issues. And yes, they are environmental justice communities, in my view.
Thank you. Before the talk this afternoon, we were talking a little bit about data, and specifically we were talking about the lack of good, consistent data on where the water and sewer infrastructure is. And that's also an issue that we've faced in trying to track evictions, and the sort of lack of good data on the race and the demographics of folks who are facing eviction, and the geographies. The question that we've got from the chat is, are there specific data-based evidence illustrating the primacy of race versus economic, regional, or rural factors as the primary cause for inadequate waste infrastructure? So I think that the question is there data that shows that it's primarily due to race, or is it due to these other factors, economic, regional, or rural, that are driving where we have inadequate waste infrastructure?
Well, I think the data is out there. It hasn't been collected, but based on our assessment and who's been getting in touch with us and where we're going and what we're seeing around the country, the consistency is race. Race seems to be a factor. If you look at communities, whether they're in the colonias in Texas, or whether you're looking at communities in Alaska and Nevada, California, the people that have been responding to our survey, they've primarily been people of color or poor people. I was a part of the National Coalition for the Human Right to Water and Sanitation, and these were primarily consisted of people that were poor or people from places like Appalachia who were experiencing these problems. So I think that what has happened with data is that as of late, that data has not been collected. And there is room to collect it. And I think the fallacy, and when I talked earlier about how these historical inequities are baked into our system, that's one way it's baked into our system. Because for some people, if the data is not there, it doesn't exist, but it doesn't mean it's not a problem. It just has not been collected yet.
Excellent, thank you. Another question was, from one of our legal aid attorneys was asking, how do we respond to critics who don't want to invest in rural communities, because they think they can have a greater impact by investing in areas that have a more dense population? How do we respond to that?
I respond to that by saying, look at how the country voted. Clearly, there are a lot of people, half the people in the country are in these communities. And as a result, they voted they don't like the way we're making these investments. and clearly, when do we get to a point in this country where the only people that should have a certain quality of life have to be in rural and urban communities? COVID showed us the first thing people did when COVID started hitting these cities was run to the countryside. They ran to the areas that were less populated. That's an indication of what's going to happen with climate change. A lot of people are going to have to relocate. And the areas of the country, if you look at a map of the United States, most of the United States is rural and unincorporated. And the reason it's rural and unincorporated, probably because of sanitation issues, because we have not found a solution yet, but we're going to be working on that. But they have, once the technology is in place, people are going to have to move. People are going to have to relocate. And one of the things that we have found out is that if you look at where the housing booms are taking place, you can go to New York now and probably find a place a lot cheaper than you could before COVID. But if you go to these smaller towns and these mid-sized cities, it's hard to find a house. I know, because I just started looking. I looked for one in the Huntsville area of Alabama, and the housing market is off the chain. People were selling houses in 24 hours and offering more than what the house is worth in order to get in the house, because they want to get away from these cities. So if the investor has any vision, then they need to start looking at these other areas that have been neglected, that have been dying, because they offer a better quality of life. And also in some cases, the housing market, a lot of people are moving from these areas because it's cheaper to go there and be able to raise a family than being in the areas where it's extremely expensive. When I was in places like San Francisco and Los Angeles, where the homeless problem is so bad, I don't see how people sleep at night. And I just, when I saw it, what I thought about is like, what does it do to your soul to be able to pass by this every day and see this person living on the street? And those are the kinds of places where people want to make investments. But maybe we should invest in these smaller areas so that people can afford to have housing. And instead of these areas where the land is so restricted because it's overcrowded. So we're going to have to come up with ways in which to make sure that all Americans get access, rural communities as well as urban communities have access to the standards that are defined in the UN Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank you. Well, building off your last comments, you're talking about the housing market and the increase in housing costs. And earlier in your talk, you talked a lot about the dangers of gentrification. One of the questions we've received has to do with, as you are investing in infrastructure, right? You talked about how the lack of infrastructure prevents investment, right? It prevents, jobs and other facilities, or pharmacies was your example, for moving into a neighborhood. It seems that unfortunately investing in this needed infrastructure can actually drive or open up a community to gentrification. So how do you balance that, or how do you combat the rising housing costs and gentrification while still providing these communities with what they need?
I think a lot of that it goes back to these structural inequities that are in place. And if we undo those, then we probably won't have gentrification, because then everybody would have access to affordable housing. It just wouldn't be in one part of the town, and usually the worst part of the town that nobody else wants to live in, next to the factory that's causing, cancer. So those are, I think those structures that we have to unpack. And once we unpack those structures that have promoted inequality since the founding of this country, which was built on slavery, free labor, I think that's when we're going to get to a point where we won't have, we have to make a choice between whether or not the poor community gets the infrastructure that's going to make it its property, something that people would desire to live or want to get, or could grow and increase in value without being pushed out. I mean, that's like a false choice. So we have to do better. But that to me, I think is the greatest example of what inequality is, and what we have to change, because it's so unfair.
One of my favorite questions that we always get after an inspiring talk like yours is, how do we get involved, right? So the question is, what recommendations do you have for people who want to get more information about these struggles and about their local situations, and how they can support affected people and advocate for them?
Well, I think one of the first things to do is that you can do to help us is to go to the Guardian site, and we can share that link where you can self-report about wastewater issues, and look around in your own communities, because they're there, and they're not just in Alabama. Everybody wants to come to Alabama and see what's happening in Lowndes County, but I tell them, just look around. They're in your own communities too, where people are either straight piping, or they have failing septic systems, or they own decentralized systems that are not working. The other thing that we're pushing for is changing the engineering paradigm. And part of changing the engineering paradigm, the way it is now, people just go into the community, design something, never live there, and leave. And when it breaks, they blame the community for it. I think the engineering paradigm should include people sitting at the table who are impacted to be a part of that. And we are promoting with our organization, we're going to be actively engaged in bringing together people from the community to be a part of the solution. And if you want to go into a community to volunteer and work, go there and ask them what they need. They'll go and tell them what they need. I think that's a large part of the problem, is people they're well-intentioned, but they don't know how to engage in the community. I just got a call from someone at a university who was called by EPA to go into a community in Louisiana because the wastewater treatment was failing. And they came to the conclusion that the reason the wastewater treatment was failing was because the people need to be educated about how to maintain it. And the people were resisting them. I said, well, have you asked them what the problem was? And they said, no. I said, well, that's why your design has failed. And they were saying, well, what can we do? We got this deadline. I said, well, there's nothing you can do because you messed up from the very beginning. You didn't ask the people in the community, and now you're asking them to accept something. And you're telling them that the reason the system is failing is because they're not educated. Who's going to accept that? And you didn't give them a chance to be a part of this at all. You came to this conclusion without going there. But they finally admitted, we don't know how to engage. So part of that is when you go and volunteer, whether it's an organization or whatever, go there and ask them, let them know what your skills are, and ask them what they need you to do. And I think that's a step in taking action. I also ask you to follow the WEJAC, the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. This is the first time this has ever been done, where environmental justice, which started in North Carolina, the whole environmental justice movement started in Warren County, North Carolina. So follow the WEJAC. There's a website. We were appointed by Biden to serve. I serve as the vice chair of this council, and I'll be in that position for 2 years. Follow that, make comments, encourage people from impacted communities to make comments when the WEJAC meets, to either make written comments or to actually watch by right now, all of our proceedings are virtual. You can watch them and then sign up to make comments because they become part of the official record. So those are things that you can do right away. And then there's a legal aid group that just sponsored me. Volunteer with them. I'm sure they're looking for volunteers. We're looking for interns. We're going to have interns this summer. I think on the 28th is the last day we're taking applications. You can go to our website. It's www.creej.org and apply if you are a college student who would like to serve as an intern this summer. And we're going to expand the program over the fall and spring. So those are just some of the ways in which you can take action. Write editorials. I think I wrote my first editorial that was published in the New York Times about wastewater. And I was surprised at the amount of people that read it. Write editorials, try to submit it to the Washington Post, submit it to the Hill. They're submitted to your local papers because the politicians pay attention when these issues get media attention, because then it puts them in a position where they can't ignore it anymore. They have to do something about it. But also make sure that you are part of the decision-making process especially if you're from an impacted community, so they won't just pile on and put something in place that's going to fail just to say that they've had a ribbon cutting and the problem solved.
Excellent. Thanks for another very thoughtful answer. I think we have time for at least one more question. This is, you mentioned, the homeless problem that you observed in a number of places, and you mentioned in your talk about how, having access to clean water to wash your hands and things like that was impossible during COVID for people suffering with these issues. During COVID, the question is, during COVID, our homeless community in Durham found that some of their pathways to safe hygiene, to bathrooms and hand washing stations, were shut down due to the pandemic. And there was a community group that set up some maybe unpermitted, but low-tech hand washing stations around town. And the problem was bathrooms, right? And we had a hard time getting traction to fund or place porta potties around town. This is from the audience member. How do we get cities and counties to sort of take this seriously? Just access to bathrooms and water and these type of facilities, especially during COVID, but more broadly for the dehoused or houseless population?
That's a good question. And maybe one thought is to actually have public toilets available that may not be in a business. I just remember when I visited Geneva and visit some other European towns, I didn't necessarily have to go into a business to use a bathroom. Of course, you had to have a token to do it, but that's better than not having anything at all. So that may be one way to do it, but I know that when I was part of the National Coalition for the Human Right to Water and Sanitation, there was an activist who testified before a lot of the committees that we spoke to, who talked, and she was homeless herself, and she talked about not having access to bathrooms and how people would run them out of restaurants and so forth. And for me, because I'm older, so that's a new thing. People weren't doing that before. I remember even now when I travel and I try to stop at places where I know I can have an access to a bathroom. But in these cities, I think it's going to be up to local citizens to push for ordinances to stop that, to where people they can have access to bathroom facilities, or to advocate for money to be put aside to build. And if we're not going to address the homeless problem right away, to build public bathrooms that people can have access to.
Well, again, Catherine, we've got a lot of excellent questions, but I want to be respectful of your time and of our attendees. So, feel free, you can contact us. We want to continue to have this dialogue, and I know you're going to continue to be engaged in the work, not just nationally, but here in North Carolina and in Durham. And really want to thank you again for taking this time with us this afternoon. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Clark, who's going to give us some important announcements and take us out. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.
My name is Dr. Alexis Clark, and I'm Community Resource Coordinator for the Durham Eviction Diversion Program. I'd like to close today's talk by extending my sincere thanks to Catherine for elucidating all the connections between environmental, racial, economic, and social justice. And of course, I'd like to thank Peter and everyone in attendance for contributing such thoughtful comments and insightful questions. Too many of our neighbors in North Carolina confront circumstances comparable to those described by Catherine. Many of our neighbors may live in homes without access to basic sanitation, that in turn causes them to experience illness, adverse educational outcomes, downward mobility, and ultimately indignity. A truly just society demands that all may live in and with dignity, not debt and deprivation. Well, the fight to ensure that our neighbors live their day-to-day lives with respect directs what we do at Legal Aid of North Carolina. That fight extends outside the courtroom. Whether as an attorney, volunteer, or donor, you can fight this fight with us, demanding a fair world now and a better world for the future. The current CDC moratorium on evictions has been set to expire at the end of June. For many who have struggled to pay rent throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, the end of the moratorium will mean the end of their housing security. With your help, however, we are determined to raise at least $100,000 in rental assistance to keep families facing eviction housed. Donating your financial resources and volunteering your time make all the difference to our organization and to our neighbors. For those interested in donating or volunteering, please contact me, and I've included those details in the chat. I'd lastly invite all of you to learn more about the issues discussed today. In June, we'll continue this discussion with a roundtable talk on the connections between health and home. Then on July 29th, Jean Nickel, professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill School of Law, and author of The Faces of Poverty in North Carolina, Stories from Our Invisible Citizens, will speak as part of our virtual lecture series. We'll hope to see you in the Zoom room and on the front lines in our fight for justice. Thank you.